Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big L Devlin video. And this is a continuation, a part 2 if you wish, to the introduction that we had on our series of pugilism. Where I left you off was really at the point where Mendoza came in, who was an 18th century prize fighter who introduced a lot of what can really be considered the foundations of modern style boxing. He introduced a variety of different things such as speed. Rather than just relying on brute strength, Mendoza used his speed to gain an offensive advantage over his opponents, but he also used his speed and his mobility to improve his defense. Introducing the concept of head movement. Now don't get me wrong, prize fighters, pugilists, boxers, whatever you want to call them, at this point of course did defend themselves. Fatalities in pugilism prior to the Broughton rule set were very, very common, and crippling injuries even more so. At the end of the day, you could lose your eyes quite easily in a pugilistic fight. So the old style pugilist fighters did of course defend themselves. They had their health and their lives on the line. It's just Mendoza took it to a whole new level, and as such, he was one of the greatest champions in pugilism of all time. As I mentioned just a moment ago, one of the things he introduced was the concept of head movement. This was seen as actually being a coward's way out prior to Mendoza. What? To duck or to slip or to move out of the way of a punch? Why would anyone do that? But he used it to his advantage, and even though it was labelled, as I say, as a coward's way out at the very beginning, his fight record truly spoke for itself and turned the masses onto his side, gaining him great popularity. In addition to head movement, Mendoza created this concept of standing side on to your opponent rather than in a much more square on stance. This square on stance, of course, giving you a great defense against the grappling aspect of pugilism, but having a stand on stance allowed Mendoza to strike with greater range and to also be a smaller target himself against incoming strikes. And now, of course, having a much more side-on profile, he altered the positions of the hands also. Instead of having both arms extended outwards, he instead brought one hand back to cover most of the time his body, but sometimes also his head when he felt needed. And he would extend his lead arm, his jab hand essentially, forwards as a deterrent to an advancing opponent. The advantages of this is, of course, it makes it easier for a fighter to parry and to block incoming punches. But at the same time, having one hand brought back not only adds defense to your head or to your body, but allows you to throw a much more powerful punch from such a position. And this new stance that Mendoza created proved to be so effective at granting him victory over much bigger, stronger opponents that it then became the default stance for every pugilist fighter following him. And of course, it laid the foundations for the modern boxing stances that you see today. And really the reasons why Mendoza developed this stance was because he was actually only 5'7", that's 1.7 meters, and around 160 pounds of body weight, so roughly 73 kilograms. And this is back when pugilism didn't have weight categories, so it was a sport dominated by the very biggest and strongest of men. In fact, it was quite common for the average pugilist fighter to be over 6 foot tall and weighing anywhere between 90 and 100 kilograms to anywhere between 200 and 220 pounds. But because of Mendoza's very scientific approach to his fighting style, he became the literal personification of the story of David versus Goliath, becoming the heavyweight champion of England from the year 1792 until 1795. And in fact, Mendoza was only defeated by a man called John Jackson. John Jackson, like many of Mendoza's opponents, was by far the larger of the two men, being over 4 inches taller than Mendoza and weighing over 40 pounds heavier. John Jackson was otherwise known as the Gentleman, but don't let that fool you. He was a pugilist of the truest form, employing fully street fighting techniques to grab Mendoza by his hair, pinning his head in place whilst he then pummeled and continuously hit Mendoza so much to the head that Mendoza was unable to come back even after a 30-second count. And with any luck, this will be actually a fighter along with Mendoza that we'll cover later on in this series in more detail. However, it was Mendoza that published The Art of Boxing, a fighting manual if you wish, that was published in 1792, outlining the clear scientific boxing technique that he developed. It was his aim to turn pugilism from a relatively barbaric sport into something more akin to an art form. And in fact, I already have a copy of that training manual. I'm very blessed to have that, and I will be reading from it, as I mentioned in the previous video, as a significant part of this series, and sharing with you his teachings and his writings. But to just start you off, here's one quote from his book that shows you how this guard of the fisticuff stance, if you wish, came into play. He writes, "It must be an invariable rule to stop or to parry your adversary's right with your left, and his left with your right. And both in striking and parrying, always keep your stomach guarded by barring it with your right or left forearm." And of course, we very much see this advice being employed, as I say, within every pugilistic fighter that followed him. And we see this stance evolving into the more modern boxing stances, following the Queensberry rules, which were introduced in 1860. The reason then that the stance began to evolve and develop into much more modern styles is because, of course, during the Queensberry rules, gloves were introduced in competitive fights. Prior to this point, boxing gloves were actually only ever used in training, never in competitive fights. And of course, as we discussed in the first video, boxing gloves actually make it easier to strike the head with a greater degree of force, and so that's why the stances then started to evolve. With the usage of gloves, with the usage of hand protection, heads were now becoming the primary target over that of the body. Alright guys, well that's the end of the part 2 of the introductory video to our new pugilism series. From now on, you'll see actually a variety of different videos, and of course over time the videos will evolve. I'll get new ideas and we'll introduce new concepts, but at the moment the ideas that I have is to do a fighter series where I introduce you to famous pugilist fighters, talk about their fight records, and share as much information of course that I can get hold of. Of course, part of that is limited to the fact that, you know, some of the fighters lived over 200 years ago. But with some of the later fighters, I'll actually be able to share fight footage, because there is some fight footage, as I say, from the late 1800s onwards. Like I've done before on more modern day fights, I'll actually also do a commentary over the boxing fights also, and tell you what I think they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and we'll use that as a focus to learn, develop our own knowledge, and even our own techniques, of course, if you're a fighter yourself. There's something I really would like to do as well. I would actually like to demonstrate these techniques myself. I mean, those who know me will know that, of course, I've actually got 27 years of fighting experience myself. And so I would love to be able to get in the ring, or at least on a bag, and show you how some of these stances and some of the techniques involved can actually be really effective. However, in the meantime, the next few videos that I do will be simply just readings directly from the Art of Boxing by Daniel Mendoza. So I'll be actually reading in his own words how he explains the scientific principles about turning pugilism into essentially what is modern day boxing. So overall guys, quite a short video. It was just finishing off what I couldn't fit in the last one. So what I want to do is actually just, for those who are interested, share with you some bonus facts which you might actually really enjoy to hear. Of course, these may actually become the focus of videos in the future also. The first fact I would like to give to you is one that I touched upon in the previous video actually, and that is the longest known boxing fight in history. It took place in New Orleans on April the 6th, 1893, between two pugilist fighters named Andy Bowen and Jack Burke. And if you look to the screen at the moment, I have actually included photographs of the two fighters, which will be coming up and about during the time that I'm speaking at the moment. But guys, I will be doing a video focusing on this fight, so I don't want to give you too many spoilers, other than to say that the fight between these two men lasted a total of well, in theory 111 rounds, but it was 110 fighting rounds, lasting 7 hours and 19 minutes. That's pretty goddamn horrific, as I'm sure you can understand, especially when rounds back then, they weren't timed. Every single round was ended because of either a knockdown or knockout or being thrown to the ground. And the last fact of the day that I'll share with you guys is, if you've stepped in the ring or had any kind of boxing experience in any way whatsoever, I think we'll all appreciate the fact that we use mouth guards these days, right? They stop us biting our tongues off and they protect our teeth and our gums. And it was actually a man called Jock. Who knew, guys, at the end of this video would not only be a facts section but a bloopers also. Right, so the man's name was Jack Moles, who was a London dentist, and he introduced the first mouth guard for the use of boxers in the year 1902. Now, at first, the safety measure to protect a fighter's teeth and mouth was actually only used in training sessions. So it wasn't actually used in competitive fights still until the year 1913. And it was in 1913 that a boxer actually wore one for the very first time in an official fight. Now, of course, it didn't take very long for this to catch on and for all boxers from then on in to be wearing one, right up, of course, into modern day. Right then, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, again, as much as I did filming it. I really am enjoying this series. I hope it's coming across as well, the enthusiasm and the passion. So, if you've guys got any questions, any ideas, any particular topic within pugilism or old style boxing that you want me to do a video on, please just put them in the comments or just message me and I'll try to accommodate you as best as I can. In the meantime, guys, I will see you hopefully very soon. Stay safe, stay well, and I'll say goodbye. Goodbye.